This is K.M. Wyland, and you are listening to the 402nd episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I just took a 10-day break from all things work and writing to visit my sister and her family. We had a great time, but as always, the hardest thing about traveling is leaving behind my writing, especially when it's going well, as it is right now. It feels like abandoning a wonderful relationship to go on a trip. I know lots of writers who are brave enough to take their writing with them when they travel and commit to working on it, but that just never works for me. My attention is too fragmented, the writing feels like a burden, and the quality of the writing suffers. And yet, leaving for 10 days and coming back to try to pick up the pieces right where you left off is disorienting as well. I always like it when a trip coincides with one of my quarterly edits, which it did not this time, but that's always helpful for getting back into the flow of it. At any rate, there's nothing for it this week but to just jump back in with both feet. And now I hope you enjoyed this week's podcast, 5 tips for organizing your subplots. Imagine you walk into a candy shop, but what you discover inside, instead of candy, is display after display of subplots. Enough to make any writer's mouth water, right? Writers love the idea of subplots. They're rich, juicy, complex, and full of opportunities for taking your story to the next level. But organizing subplots, or even just figuring out what subplots are, that can sometimes be trickier. I'm often asked about subplots, but it's one of those subjects, like POV, that is bigger than just a simple answer. This is because subplots, when done right, are all but camouflaged within the larger story. Good subplots integrate with the main plot to the point they're inextricable from the story's bigger picture. In short, you can't master the art of organizing subplots without mastering the art of plotting itself. For that, of course, you need story structure, character arc, theme, all that fun junk. But today, let's assume you've already packed your cart with all those nourishing vegetables, which leaves you free to fulfill your sweet tooth by raiding ye old subplot shop. But first, confession time. I actually don't even like talking about subplots. Whenever someone asks me, how do I write subplots, it makes me incredibly squirmy. I don't have a good, simple answer, which is why it's taken me 10 years to do a full-blown episode on this subject. For the simple reason that subplots are not a good way to think about story. In fact, I recommend you stop thinking about subplots altogether. Instead, just think about plot. This is for one simple reason. If your subplot doesn't work within the larger plot to the point that it's inextricable from it, then it simply doesn't work. If you find yourself thumbing through your manuscript and going, subplot, 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 it may well be because these subplots are sticking out like speed bumps on the highway. When I sit down to plot a novel, I never think of it in terms of subplot. My stories are usually huge, sprawling, complex, and peopled with big casts. Do they have subplots? Of course. But I don't think of them that way. I don't want subplots in my stories. I don't want to hand readers a jumbled box full of really cool odds and ends. Instead, I want to give them one big cohesive plot that sparkles like a multifaceted diamond. Which is all to say, yes, today we're going to talk about subplots, and yes, I'm about to break this all down for you and show you what subplots are and how you can manage them. But the most important thing you can take away is that if it looks like a subplot, cut it. Now, before we talk about what a subplot is, we first have to talk about what it isn't. By definition, a subplot is not the main plot, which means we first need to understand what constitutes the main plot. In most fully formed stories, there are 3 aspects to the main plot. Number 1, the external conflict. When we talk about plot, this is probably the first thing to spring to mind. The external conflict is the physical aspect of the conflict. It revolves around a specific plot goal based on the thing the character wants. The character is trying to do something or gain something, but an antagonistic force keeps putting obstacles in his way. The act of the protagonist overcoming these obstacles creates the forward momentum that drives the plot, all the way from his conception of the goal at the first plot point to the climactic moment where he either definitively gains or definitively loses his objective. For example, in my Portal Fantasy sequel work in progress, Dreambreaker, the protagonist Chris Redston, who previously, in Dreamlander, which you can grab for free right now on Amazon, he visited a parallel dream world as the only gifted of his generation. And he now has the main plot goal of stopping the cataclysms that are once again threatening to destroy the balance between worlds. Number 2, the main relationship. External conflict is great. It powers the story. But it's rarely enough to truly engage readers on a deeper level. For that, you need the emotional stakes of a relationship. This could be a romance, a friendship, a business partnership, or a parent-child relationship. Whatever it is directly connected to the main conflict. Either the relationship's positive outcome hinges upon a positive outcome in the external conflict, or the relationship creates the conflict, or the conflict creates the relationship. Whatever the case, the protagonist must have a goal in this relationship, even if it is largely unspoken. Usually, it is simply for the relationship to work out. For example, although Dreambreaker is about Chris saving the worlds, what it's really about is Chris's ongoing and uncertain relationship with Alara Katahdin, Queen of Lael. Yes, he wants to end the danger to everyone, but on a more personal level, what he really wants is just to be with her in a healthy and permanent relationship. Number 3, the internal conflict. Both of the above are external manifestations of the story's theme, which plays out within the protagonist's internal conflict. His character arc will be linked to his actions in the external conflict. The conflict between the lie he believes and the truth that can set him free, between the thing he wants and the thing he needs, this is the true heart of your story. Although the character arc can play a background role within a noisy story, it is never ancillary. The more integral it is to the external plot, the more powerful the story. For example, in Dreambreaker, Chris has to deal with misconceptions about the nature of total sacrifice and what we're owed by life, which directly feed into his actions in the external plot. Okay, now that you can see what subplots are not, what are they? There are 4 primary categories of conflicts, which, although integral to the story, are still subordinate to the main conflicts mentioned above. Think of them in terms of supporting the main conflict. If they aren't an integral beam within your structural house, they don't belong. Number 1, minor character relationships. Most of the complexity of subplots arises from the supporting cast. Technically, to create a solid story form, you need only 3 types of character: protagonist, antagonist, and relationship character. But most stories offer up much larger casts, and along with them, more complexity in the plot, and thus, subplots. Your protagonist may be working through conflicts with more than one relationship character. Each of these relationship characters will, in turn, have their own goals within the external plot, and optimally their own internal conflicts as well. For example, in Dreambreaker, Chris also has to interact with his doppelganger family in the dream world, all of whom have expectations for him, some of which conflict with his own goals. Subplot number 2, minor POV characters. Your story may take these minor character relationships to the next level by giving any number of these characters POVs of their own. The moment you do this, you elevate these characters to the level of mini protagonists, which means you will explore their external, internal, and relationship goals in almost as much depth as you do the protagonists. The most important thing to keep in mind here is that, despite the popular mantra, these supporting characters are not the heroes of their stories. Not really. Their narratives, however cursory or complete, must contribute to the protagonists in a foundational way. For example, Dreambreaker introduces the POV of a new minor character, a streetwise charism named Thorn, who is a relationship character for Chris, while also pursuing his own goals in the plot and his own problems in the theme. His storyline runs largely outside of Chris's until the climax, where the two directly impact each other. Subplot number 3, lower levels of antagonists. We've talked before about the varying levels of antagonism you can feature in your story. Every story will have a primary antagonistic force, the one directly opposing your protagonist's main plot goal. But you can also feature smaller antagonists who interfere with your protagonist on his way up the mountain to face the big boss. But again, these antagonists can't create detours for the protagonist. Instead, they must ultimately be stepping stones in that journey up the mountain. For example, as epic fantasy, Dreambreaker is giving me the opportunity to explore just about every level of antagonism, all the way from world-ending stakes down to political rivals and personal betrayals. Subplot number 4, minor antagonist goals. Finally, in direct relation to the previous, you can also focus on sidelong antagonists and their goals. These are characters who are not necessarily affiliated with the main antagonistic force, but who have their own agenda, which at some point is at cross purposes to your protagonists. These characters don't even have to be bad. They could just be frustrated allies who decide to take matters into their hands at the wrong moment. For example, one of my favorite new characters in Dreambreaker is Alara's uncle, Prince Justice Katahdin, who has been in prison for treason for 20 years and has some very definite ideas about payback. Okay, now you know what subplots are and aren't, so what do you do with them? How do you weave them into your story in a way that enhances rather than detracts? And if you're writing a story as complex as, say, epic fantasy, how do you keep track of all those little devils? Here are 5 ways. Tip number 1. Create your subplots, part 1. What are your minor characters' goals? So did you notice how every single one of the sections we talked about previously revolved around somebody's goal? Goal is the engine that drives conflict. Without it, there is nothing for the antagonistic force to oppose, and no story. Just like plot itself, your subplots need to originate from someone's overpowering desire. Examine your supporting characters. Make a list of their names. And beside each name, write down what this character wants in this story. Some of the wants will be evident, some won't. But don't stop until you've brainstormed a goal for each character. Whether or not these goals become prominent in the main story, you will have instantly fleshed out your entire cast. And if any of the characters' goals turn out to have a little to nothing to do with the main plot, well then you may just have found a character you can safely cut. Tip number 2. Create your subplots, part 2. What are your protagonist's minor goals? Even though your protagonist's primary focus will be on gaining his main plot goal and defeating the main antagonistic force, he can also be the catalyst for subplots. Complex characters want more than one thing, or at least more than one facet of the same thing. But be wary. The protagonist's minor goals must ultimately tie into the execution of his main goal. It's fine for Jane Eyre to want to take care of little Adele and want to figure out what creepiness is going on in Thornfield's attic, while also wanting to figure out her relationship to Mr. Rochester. But it would not be fine if another subplot had her wanting to earn enough money to erect a mausoleum for her dead childhood friend, Helen Burns. Tip number 3. Evaluate your subplot's necessity. What's its role in the climax? Are you unsure if a subplot is really necessary to your story? Just take a look at the climax. The subplot must be one of the following. Number 1, concluded in the climax. Number 2, important to creating the climax, or number 3, directly impacted by the climax. If not, it's going to, at best, require a climax of its own, which, at best, detracts from your story's structural integrity. But it gets more complicated. It's not enough for your subplots to be directly related to your external conflict. They must also tie into your story's theme. Every subplot in your story should reflect upon your story's main lie and truth in some way. If the main theme asks, "What is sacrifice?" then your subplots must either directly comment on this question or at least explore related ideas such as conviction, selfishness, or treachery. Tip number 4. List and color code subplots. Again, I don't necessarily recommend brainstorming subplots outside of brainstorming your plot. But as you learn more and more about your story's big picture, you'll be able to identify the smaller integers that have created it. You can break this down into a handy list so you can identify all the different threads in your plot. You may then want to take this one step further and create a color code for each item on your list. You can then use this color coding system throughout your outline or manuscript to help you easily identify where each of these subplots shows up, how prevalent it is, and when and how it will be resolved. And tip number 5, combine subplots into main plot scenes. So, what's our rule of thumb for the day? That's right, there are no subplots, just plots. As such, your goal is to integrate your subplot ideas into your main plot so seamlessly, they're inextricable. Although you will probably need to create certain scenes that revolve entirely around subplot ideas, it's best if you can weave them into your main plotline's concerns as much as possible. Let's say your scene is focused on your protagonist pursuing his main plot goal in the external conflict. But present in the scene are several minor characters, and every one of them has goals of their own. These goals power subplots, which interact in this scene with the main plot. Suddenly, the subplots can't exist without the main plot, and the main plot can't exist without the subplots. And just like magic, there are no subplots. Thank you for listening to the Wordplay Podcast. To read a transcript of this episode, you can visit my website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And be sure to check back again next week.